So why won't Games Workshop fix, or I should say balance 40K, get it to a place, get it to a spot where it is playable without massive adjustments or just accepting the fatality of certain units and certain armies? That's what we're going to explore from the perspective making no apologies. And if you've been following my channel or had a chance to look at my blog, you know that I'm a massive Warhammer 40K enthusiast. I've enjoyed playing the narrative. I enjoy the universe, the social aspects. 40K for me has literally been the gateway not only to launch the other initiatives on my channel here and on my blog, but be introduced to so many amazing friends, literal friends now for 10, 15, 20 years, something crazy like that. So to say that 40K is a massive part of my life is indeed an understatement. But I need to qualify that and say there are certain realities to 40K that just, they're not going away and they're never going to go away because it's not in the best interest of Games Workshop to make them go away. So let's look at this idea of balance really first, really quick, just to kind of frame the narrative. There is this idea, we've talked about this if you explore some of my Chain of Command, World War II videos and vlogs. Generally speaking, most of the time, not all the time, your meta might be a little bit different. When you play historical war games, you know that there's no balance. Warfare isn't balanced. If it's equal, I'm not going to attack you. I think I have an advantage, or I'm going to ambush you, or I'm going to surprise you, or out of desperation, I'm attacking you, or you're attacking me. It's not this idea of we're going to show up equally on the field. You accept that in historical war games based on the mission, based on literally trying to relive and rewrite history. I mean, if we look at Chain of Command, one of the reasons why I love playing late war Germans, I love tanks. 40K, I love tanks. Battletech, I love tanks. Historicals, I love tanks. So I want to get all those tigers on the table. And the stats for some of those machines at the time are just absolutely brutal, even going up against well-equipped and fresh Americans. So if we look at it from a fairness, it's not always fair. But you understand you're living history, you're rewriting history, you're trying to pull out a win or pull out a draw or buy yourself some time. When we flip over to 40K, the Grimdark has never been fair. I mean, look at all those narratives of heroic last stands and all that. But Games Workshop has this illusion of fairness. We agree to play at a certain level. We jump over to the codexes and army lists. We do the math. We crunch the numbers. We have a bunch of units. And in theory, my army is equal to your army. Well, it doesn't play out that way for a variety of reasons. So if you think 40K is fair, and I'm going to offer my solution, then we'll turn it over to you guys in the comments, you are setting yourself up for a lot of heartache. And you are setting yourself up for going in expecting one type of game and spending 3 or 4 hours playing a different type of game. And that's not fun. We definitely want to keep that in mind. So the first aspect of 40K, why it's not balanced, we see this constant adjustment of units within each of the armies. And it's not always just a massive adjustment and say, hey, here's a new codex. Space Marines, here you go. Eldar, I'm still going to call them Eldar. I'm always going to call them Eldar. You guys just get another copy and paste job, so it's essentially the same. There is a vast difference in all of the different armies in terms of keeping them up to date, keeping them to the point where if you make a tweak in one type of unit, this unit needs to have a counter in another army list. Games Workshop is constantly injecting new stuff and new models. So right away, given the massive, massive scope of 40K, I mean, imagine if you entered every single unit, before we even get into the stats, every single unit into a spreadsheet. That's a lot to balance. That's a lot to work out. And it's not that every unit should be the same. We can have Space Marines that are super, super killy and super, super elite. I mean, they should be. But this idea, if I have 5 Space Marines, then how many Imperial Guard would there stand a reasonable chance, the swing of the dice and tactics accounted for, how many Imperial Guard would be required to remove those Space Marines off the table? 50? 60? That's kind of getting into the Black Library books, but maybe 20 or so, because we are still using a D6 system, even if it's with modified D3 or exploding dice. That's this idea of fairness. So my Imperial Guard army might have like 500 models in it, but it's fair if you've only got 100 in yours. It kind of equals out. So just from a bookkeeping perspective, Games Workshop has never kept up with that. And if you look over the numerous editions that have been released, it's a tiered army system. Space Marines get all the love. Then other armies that are going to be the foil get the secondary love for that. And then Xenos and everybody else just kind of completely fall into stream. There's also injected into that this idea that as Games Workshop introduces entirely new units. Now, we're going to go back a little bit. We're going to time travel back, step through the warp, crack open in the Sacred Halls of Terra some accounts of Warhammer 40K when the Vendetta and the Valkyrie was released. This was 5th edition 40K. Flyers did not exist in 40K yet, true flyers. You had to use Forge World rules. And they come out and say, okay, we're going to introduce this, and it's not true flyer rules, but they introduced a new class of models, just these kind of flying models. They made the stats insane, and they didn't play test anything because the idea was, we want to sell these models. Games Workshop is a models company first, IP narrative, get the money from other sources, company second. They're not really a wargaming company. They're not really a rules-centric company. Look at something like Chain of Command, World War II historicals, Spanish Civil War, World War I. They operate, they sell you the rules. You can play with any miniatures you want. I mean, you could use the kind of the old school plastic army men and play with that. Games Workshop is meant, you're supposed to play the Space Marine with the chainsword and the bolt pistol. But that's what we're here for. That's what we're there for, the narrative. So we have this massive scope. And even if Games Workshop was taking the time to balance it, they constantly inject new units. They constantly have this feed cycle of buy more, buy more, buy more. And you try to keep up. Nothing is ever going to be balanced. I mean, the size of that play team would be incredible. Now, there have been gripes over the years that it's not balanced. Can you play test it? And they bring in some play testers, but these play testers have a competitive point of view. So it's kind of like a negative feedback chamber where what plays for 40K is just take more Uber units. Just take the best units of the month, flavor of the month, copy and paste, spam it out, and just play it from that perspective where if you're trying to build out your narrative or your themed army, you're just going to get absolutely squashed. So Games Workshop is relying on numerous outside playtesters and feedback with a very small in-house testing. It's just impossible. It's just impossible. It's like giving me a shovel and some sandbags and telling me to build a dam. It's never, ever going to happen. So that's the first aspect. You just have to accept the cycle. Now we get into, even with that possibility, there is a way they could balance it. That is through the mission. Coming up with narrative missions where you go in knowing, okay, the armies are not going to be balanced, but if you achieve objectives, it's kind of funny. They every edition of 40K, it's like the narrative edition, cinematic edition, epic play. No, it's just how fast can I remove your models off the table? That's it. Just how fast can I remove your models off the table? I optimize my units for that. I look for combos and buffs. I look for massive amounts of dice pools, and there you go. I mean, sadly, that's what it is. You can balance that out by having missions. I mean, I know I'm generalizing here. Imagine this mission. You bring whatever in your collection at a certain point level, maybe double, and I'm in the center of the table, and I've got some fortification. I need to hold it for X number of turns. If you can break my army in those turns, you win. Otherwise, reinforcements win. If we look at some of the missions from Apocalypse was actually very interesting, and this isn't like nostalgia going back saying Apocalypse was great. When Apocalypse first came out, Games Workshop was like, we can't balance it. And we want to get people to play tons and tons of models, because at the time they had this idea called a force org chart. They tried to balance things where literally you could only take certain numbers of units that were in play. And they're looking and saying, okay, well, you can only take 3 Vindicators and Iron Warriors can take 4. So we want people to go out and buy like 20 Vindicators. So we'll come up with Apocalypse where you can play anything. There isn't even point levels. You could bring your massive collection. I have my small collection. But through the missions, through the interaction, through the stratagems, it became more than just killing models off the table. That was the step in the right direction, but Games Workshop couldn't necessarily control that, handing that control over to the players. How are you going to get me to buy more models? If I'm rule set agnostic and I'm playing based on the narrative, and I always want to play my 20 Vindicators, and I can, once I have those 20 Vindicators, and I don't have 20 Vindicators, I've got 4. I do have 6 Land Raiders. I have about 15 Dreadnoughts. It's a little bit out of control, but there's no incentive to buy more. But if they constantly readjust, force you to buy and buy and buy, and I don't care what they say about their missions, make it about cleaning models off the table, then you're in that cycle. You're in that cycle. So they could absolutely balance it out through the missions. And that's the way to do it, because then you can have all the points you want. You can give crazy abilities. You can give overpowered abilities. But you funnel them through the mission. So going back to the type of game that you expect, I was playing a narrative Eldar list. This was a couple of years back. I was playing a narrative Eldar list that I wanted to bring to an apocalypse game. And I showed up to play at the club, and I'm cool. I'll play a game with anybody. Let's roll some dice. Let's have some fun. And the person I was playing brought a rock hard, optimized, competitive list. They were in tournament play. And looking at that list, having that knowledge, I said, I'm going to bring my Footdar list, my narrative list. It's basically Space Elf powers and what crazy combos could I do. Not that Wraith Lords were ever any good in 40K. But playing that on the table, I said, do you want me to bring a different list? I kind of really want to play this list. Do you want to rewrite your list? Because you're just going to steamroll over me in 2 turns. And my opponent was like, he knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing. He's like, no, it's all good. It's balanced. We're playing the points and we're going to play this mission. And I'm like, no, your list admittedly is optimized for a tournament. I'm bringing a narrative list. You're going to destroy me. We'll play it out because I want to just play it and let's see what happens. I've got the time. Turn 2, I'm like wiped off the table. It was just absolutely, absolutely crazy. Now imagine if you were new to 40K, because there's no balance, there's no oversight, there's no mission balance. And it is kind of pay to play. If you can get the most recent toys, you're in. Imagine if you were a new player to 40K and you're pumped and you're excited and you have your models and you painted them and you don't have the knowledge yet, the experience of playing, to be able to look at someone's army and be like, dude, you're blowing smoke at me. Don't sit here in 2 or 3 minutes telling me it's about the hobby and bringing hobby back and you're throwing this list down. I mean, no. If you can't see that, imagine now you play the game and you're like, what did I do wrong? What's wrong? And that level of crushing defeat, I've seen it on new players. That's why I always recommend for new players not only play narrative games, but play team-based games. 2 or 3 people on each side, be part of a team. More players, the more fun. You get to see more, and you get a lot of social interaction, and you get to a lot of see of units in play. So there's ways to approach it. But in terms of 40K being balanced, I gave up on that long ago. I have no expectations of that, and it requires a lot of homebrew, a lot of just not even trying to figure it out, but ultimately what it comes down to is playing with the group you want to play. If that's competitive, competitive. It's that narrative, that's narrative. If it's a GM type system, game master type system, you do that. But GW will never balance their stuff. They're capable of doing it. They can do it. Look at some of the specialist games. Look at Titanicus. But for mainstream 40K, absolutely no incentive, because it's just selling models and models and models and get you into that buying cycle of eternal return of just buying more and more and more new stuff.